Hi everybody, I am Howard and this is Otter's Corner. Before I get too far into this video today, I gotta do what I'm told I have to do. Remind you to subscribe. I think it's right down there somewhere, the subscribe button. The like button's right there, it's a little thumbs up. Please smash that like button. Share and comment. And while we're talking about comments, that's kind of the topic today. I received a comment from a subscriber, several comments actually, and several requests to talk about some topics. And it's going to be a little tricky because they're very specific topics, but I'm going to try to generalize them a little bit so that they fit a situation that all of you might be concerned about. And I'm going to have a lot of notes here. I'm going to look down and read a little bit, so I haven't left you. I'm still here. But I just want to make sure I cover this. It's a little complicated. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. So in general, the first question this subscriber asks is, in essence, what happens to good funds, either stock or, he was specifically talking about bonds, but I'm going to talk about stocks and bonds. What happens to good hot funds when people rush in with new money? So you know what happens, there's a hot new fund or even an old fund that suddenly has become hot, it's earning more than the other funds in its category, or it's much better than the index funds. Everybody's writing about it. Hey, this is a great new fund. Morningstar gives it 5 stars. Barron's writes about it. It's on CNBC. Hey, this great fund, great manager. It gets attention and money rushes in. So I'm going to answer the question of what do you do about hot stock or fund tips? And the answer is generally stay away. And here's the reason why. And it's called regression to the mean. Very few funds outperform the general indexes for more than 2-3 years. You'll find some that do it for 5 years, but what happens is it regresses back to the mean, where it falls back to the average of what that fund should be earning for you. And that's more often with stock funds, because you don't see great variances in bond funds. So you hear people like Dave Ramsey, who, financial advisors and people like me don't generally agree with when it comes to investing. He'll say something like, hey, it's not rocket science. You find the funds that are performing the best and you buy them. Well, that's absolutely not what you do. You look for, in my opinion, you look for index funds. You might want to buy an S&P index fund. You might want to buy an all-market fund or ETF. The Vanguard ATI is one of the very popular ones. It covers all the stocks in the U.S. Or BND is their bond ETF that covers, the whole world, not the whole world, but the whole universe of bonds as far as different types of bonds, not just corporate. And when you go into those hot funds, you're in for a disappointment. You can look at some bottom funds. Suddenly, 2-3 years from now, they're outperforming all the indices. They're the new hot funds. It rotates. And what happens over time is a very small percentage, maybe 5% or less, of funds or ETFs are able to outperform the indexes. And that's why I always say stay with the indexes. It's too difficult to figure out which funds are going to stay hot and which are not. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when, as my subscriber asked, he found a bond fund that was performing well. And his question was, once all that money rushes in, when everyone hears how well it's doing, what happens? Well, first of all, let's separate out what we're talking about here. There are many kinds of bond funds. Generally, we're talking about corporate bond funds. And within corporate bond funds, there's investment grade bonds, which are generally BBB or higher on the Moody's rating. There's Fitch and S&P, but that BBB level is the separation of what is referred to as investment grade, or the stronger or the safer bonds. Under that, BB and lower are what is referred to as junk. They're not technically junk, but they're called junk bonds because they're highly speculative, they're much more risky, they're more likely to default, And even when we say more likely, very low percentage of them actually default, but they do default. Understand that. And they'll pay higher returns because they are more risky. So, beyond corporates, you have munis, which are state or local municipalities issue bonds. They're usually much lower yields on them because they're tax free. There's tax advantages on them. You have federal bond funds, which are treasuries. And then you have the federal agencies, Ginnie Mae, Sallie Mae, mortgage-backed securities, things like that. Those are kind of a different animal. So we're gonna talk generally about corporate bond funds, and it doesn't matter whether they're junk or they're investment grade. They kind of perform in the same manner. And I'm going to put some glasses on to read here. Yeah, I'm 67 years old. I need glasses occasionally. Get over it. I did. All right, so bond funds in general react to interest rate movements. And here's a differentiation between how bonds respond to corporate performance versus stocks. Bondholders are looking for companies to return their interest and principal. They don't care how much money the company makes. They don't care, what their outlook is, as long as they can pay back those bonds. If it looks like they're doing so poorly and the cash isn't coming in and they can't pay the bonds, that's when things change. But if they make $5 a share in earnings versus $6 or $7 or $8, it's meaningless to the bondholders because they're just looking for a return of their principal plus the interest payments promised. Whereas stocks will respond to those changes in corporate performance. All things being equal, a company earning $1 a share will not do as well as that same company earning $2 a share in profit. So stocks will change, will go up and down based upon how the corporation is doing far more than bonds will. And bonds will respond more to the general interest rate environment. So when a company issues a bond and say, they're issuing what's called par, which is $1,000. So they're going to issue a bond at $1,000 and they're going to pay 5% interest. So you're going to receive $50 a year for that bond for, if it's a 30-year bond, for every year for 30 years. Then at the end of 30 years, you get $1,000 back. Now, if interest rates rise, the price of the bond falls, so that the yield of that interest rate on the new price is equal to general market rate. So what might happen is that $1,000 bond may fall to $900. So now if someone buys that bond on the secondary market, say you have it and you sell it to them, you'll get $900. So they'll pay $900 and they'll still get that 5% interest. That never changes it. What's called the coupon. That's 5%. But now they're getting it on $900. So instead of that $50 being 5%, it's now 5.56% because general market rates rose. That bond fell, and now that's what they're getting. So within a bond fund or a bond ETF, there's a collection of all these corporate bonds. And generally, they get priced based upon their ratings. And again, there's Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, and the ratings are generally very close. There may be a one-notch difference now and then. So if you take ABC company and it's got a AA rating, and you take EFG company and they've got a AA rating, and they're both 30-year bonds, they may have very similar characteristics. They'll have the same interest payment, they'll have the same interest rate, they'll have the same yield to maturity. And the way yield to maturity differs from interest the coupon on the bond is it measures how much you're going to get in interest plus how much you're going to get back in principal. So that one we talked about before where someone paid $900, they're going to get $100 more than they paid. They're going to get $1,000 plus that $50 a month interest. So that yield to maturity is higher than the person who paid $1,000 and is getting that 5% interest. So now, sorry, glasses again. We're going to talk about something called duration, and that's a measure of interest rate risk. And it combines how long of a term the bond has, its interest rates, its ratings, and it produces a number which is called duration, and duration is a measure of the interest rate risk. So that generally you can say and it's measured in years, so you might have a bond with a duration of 6 years, or a bond fund with an average duration of 6 years. And the general rule of thumb is for every 1% rise or fall in interest rates, the fund or the bond price will change by 6%. Some people say it's the duration minus 1. There's different formulas out there, but it's pretty close. It's generally in that neighborhood. And don't be concerned with that now. When you're buying bond funds, you might look at that to understand how it's going to react. Long-term bond funds with 30-year, they might have much longer durations, so as interest rates change, they'll change more. As we saw interest rates rise over the last year or so, 2 years, those bond funds dropped well more than the ones with very short durations or short terms remaining in those bonds. All right, so what happens? What's a hot bond fund? Generally, when we're looking to apples, a corporate bond fund, say with an average rating of AA, they might buy 300 different bonds, and the average rating is AA, and then you got another, Fidelity versus Vanguard, they'll have the same characteristics, an average of AA. Well, those funds aren't going to perform very differently. They're really not. They may have different bond holdings, but within those ratings, unless those ratings change drastically, those funds are going to perform very similarly. So, as we talk about a hot bond fund, and if you look at the differences, the difference in the returns when you compare apples to apples are very small. Now, you may have a bond fund that has very few holdings, and it may be that a change in the characteristics of one of the company's bonds it holds, or 2 or 3, may change drastically, then that bond fund may change drastically, but generally you don't see that. So if you want to call it a hot bond fund, it's 0.1% higher yield to maturity or return than another bond fund. How will that respond to an influx of money? And what the subscriber said, will it then have to buy bonds with a lower yield? And that's possible. Yes, it might. So it might dilute the fund a little bit, but generally what happens is at the time you buy that bond fund, there's an overall yield to maturity, and if it goes out and buys similar bonds, they'll have the same yield to maturity. So within bond funds, number one, there's really not what I would call hot bond funds within the same class. You may find junk bonds performing much better because it's a great interest rate environment. We're in a growth environment, and some of those really risky companies are suddenly taking off. So a junk bond fund may suddenly be a hot fund compared to a investment grade bond fund, but versus other high yield bond funds, there may not be a huge difference. You'll more likely see a difference there than you would in the investment grade, but it's not going to be huge. And again, money rushing in may or may not change the characteristics, but probably not to a whole lot. So with bond funds, I wouldn't worry too much about it. When we get to stock funds, that's a whole different thing. And now, as we talked about before, stock funds, ETFs, will hold 100, 200, 300, depending upon what kind of fund it is, and especially if it's not an index fund. There's sector funds, there's industry funds, there's just, value funds. And if they're not index funds, if they're just buying smaller numbers of stocks, 60, 70, 80, 100, they are subject to hot funds. There are funds that will outperform greatly because the stocks they hold will see their earnings rise, see their earnings per share rise, and you have a hot fund. So what happens when new money flows into that? Well, there's several effects. Typically, what you see is funds have within their bylaws a rule that they must invest X amount of money, a percentage of the money in their fund, in stocks, invested at all times. So they might say 85% of the money you put into our fund must be invested in stocks at all times, a minimum of 85%. They might be 100% invested in stocks except for little cash inflows and outflows here and there. So in rising markets, when more money comes in and they have to hold a little bit of cash, it will hurt the fund a little bit because cash doesn't return what stocks does. In a falling market, it's the opposite. It'll buffer the stock fund. Although in falling markets, you don't see great influxes of cash into stock funds. People tend to buy more when stocks are going up, sadly, and buy less when stocks are going down, sadly, because it should be the exact opposite. So with stocks, what we see happen is there may not be many bargains left as the stock fund managers see it, and they may not know what to do with that cash and have to hold cash longer than they'd like, or they're going to buy stocks that don't do as well as the stocks in their portfolio, so it does hurt the return. And we've seen that a lot with what you would call hot stock funds. The influx of money does hurt them. What does happen also is that they will just stop the influx of money. They'll say no new investments. It hurts them a little bit because they're taking a share of every dollar in that fund, but they know they're not going to be able to get the return they've had in the past because they're going to have to buy stocks when prices aren't good or when they don't see any more bargains. And it may happen the opposite way. You may have a small stock fund that suddenly takes off. It's got 50, 60 maybe as few as 30 holdings, and because a few of the stocks have really great returns, the fund does extremely well, more money comes in, and they have 20 other target companies that, this small stock fund buying small cap stocks, sees the opportunities and are able to buy more, and the stock fund continues to perform as it does. But in general, I would say an influx of money to a hot stock fund typically will hurt it, as opposed to bonds, where I don't think it makes too much of a difference. So that's my answer to this question is don't buy the hot funds. I'm not giving you advice. I'm just saying, from my viewpoint, you're better off not buying the hottest thing. Stick to index funds. We all like to think we're good stock pickers, but, try it on paper for a while and you'll probably see that you're not. You won't be able to outperform the indexes. If you like value or like growth, buy an index growth fund or index value fund. One will perform better than the other, and then they'll probably both underperform the S&P 500 or the all market ATI Vanguard index ETF. But live and learn. Try to do it on paper first. Know what you're doing. Again, subscribe, like, share, and comment. Just as this one subscriber had these comments that spurred a topic, and it's going to probably spur one or two more coming up. Let me know what you want to hear about, what you want to talk about, anything to do with investing and retirement. And the things I talked about today work both prior to retirement as you're building your wealth, and after retirement as you're trying to preserve your wealth and withdraw. So make smart decisions, educate yourself, and good luck with that investing. I'll see you next time. Thanks and goodbye.